Yeah, thank you so much, Angela, for taking time to be here and talk about this. I know you have a busy schedule, so I appreciate you making time for this. Also, happy belated birthday. On your
Thank
birthday.
you. I appreciate that.
But
I appreciate
to
it.
people who don't know you, Angela, who are you?
So my name is Angela Parker Quarles. I live in Harrisburg. I'm working currently for Christian Churches United as the project manager of the Men's Winter Overnight Shelter. And I'm also working part-time with the Fair Housing Council at Capitol Reef as the eviction prevention specialist.
And what is your work like? Like, what do you do in that role?
So, in both roles, we addressed homelessness, prevention of homelessness, trying to get people to go from being affected by COVID-19 or generational poverty or whatever their situation is, and moving them into rebuilding, establishing, reestablishing, getting on their feet and moving forward. At Christian Churches United, we have a unique opportunity to work with individuals that are living on the street, some of which that's their lifestyle, that's what they want, but some of which that's not their lifestyle, and it is something that the crisis, the current crisis has gotten them or has led them into. At Fair Housing Council, I take calls from individuals who are facing eviction, trying to connect them with services in the community so that it can prevent it, and at the same time also trying to rebuild that relationship between that landlord and that tenant.
And so, what types of individuals do you encounter in doing this work? And has that changed like since COVID? Has that looked different since people are being evicted as a result of whether it's being unemployed because of COVID or whatever may be the circumstances there? Has that changed in the last year or so?
So with the emergence, the men's winter overnight shelter, that population has increased a little bit since COVID, but typically every year we have a men's winter overnight shelter. It looks different this year. It's located differently this year because of COVID. The space that we would typically have it could not accommodate the social distancing, both for staff and for the guests that utilize this shelter. So everything is looking different. The faces, the locations, the services, the needs, it's all looking different. I feel like there's an increase in drug and alcohol and mental health. The coping of being able to cope with this virus. Individuals that are homeless, some of them don't have insurance, some of them are afraid to go to a hospital. So one of the things that we try to do in that shelter is to connect them with the resources so that they can at least be healthy, so that the decisions that they're making are informed. From the fair housing perspective, we've seen a tremendous increase in calls. Individuals who are facing eviction, some are in the moment being evicted, some just got their notice to quit or their court paperwork. It covers the gamut. The one thing that I want to say to individuals is don't wait till the last minute. Don't wait until you have court paperwork. Don't wait until the constable is about to come to your house and lock you out. Reach out as soon as you know you're not going to be able to pay your rent. As soon as you know you're struggling, reach out.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for doing that work because a lot of people are struggling. I've been to communities where I see the eviction notices on the door personally. So yeah, I appreciate that you're doing that work. Something I wanted to tap into is, um, well, what exactly like? So I said what types of individuals, but more specifically, is there a demographic that's being overly or highly represented in this group? Is it people of color? Is it mostly older folks? Who's the large majority of these people that are being evicted right now or facing eviction?
So from the eviction standpoint, it covers the gamut. I mean, we have young individuals and we have individuals all the way up to senior citizens in their 70s and 80s that are affected by this. Some of the individuals facing eviction, they've had, it's been a behavior, so to speak, where they're late paying their rent or they don't, or they completely stop paying their rent when the pandemic hit. So some of it, there's a history to it. So those cases are typically a little more difficult to get the landlord to the table to mediate the situation. But there are individuals that are just facing it beginning with COVID and just need that I have a couple of people that are younger people that lost their second job, right? And that's how they were making ends meet. And a lot of times those individuals have one job, so they're not eligible for the services that are out there because they make too much money. So that's a huge gap. I think that those folks who are working and lose a portion of their income should be considered for some assistance. But mostly it's African American, and I say it runs the gamut of early 20s all the way through 80.
And so that's something that's come up in other interviews I've done on this subject, is that it seems to disproportionately be people of color. And so what would you say? Well, first of all, would you say comfortably that there is a housing crisis specifically in the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, person of color community?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say that. I would say that, and I say it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's been going on generationally in our communities, the African American community. Unfortunately, we've been generationally challenged with poverty, but it also compounds it even more when you have a pandemic that is happening. Individuals of color who never had an eviction on their record are now facing eviction, so their rentability is getting less and less. So it's having a huge impact on the Black community on so many levels.
Yeah, and that's something that actually you hit on there. That having an eviction on their record actually makes it harder for them to find that housing. And so, from your perspective, um, you work in a men's shelter, so you see what happens when people are unable to find a home. You see the influx of people during this time. Do you think that a lot of this, or at least a sizable portion of this, could be fixed by having some type of legislation or something where landlords cannot consider evictions, or evictions from this time in American history when we're facing an unprecedented pandemic that people didn't bring upon themselves for sure? Those evictions shouldn't show up on their record so that they can find somewhere to stay.
That's a loaded question. I do think that there should be more efforts placed on mitigating the traumatic circumstances from this pandemic. I do not believe that the answer, however, is to continuing shelling out money, just continuing to put a moratorium in place. We also have to educate people. We have to educate them and provide them with the tools to help them up so that they don't stay down. We've shown that, well, I don't know if you want to say we've shown, but we've had some stimulus money thrown at us, so to speak. But people who are struggling and who can't pay a bill, when they get that money, they're not worrying about paying a bill because they're traumatized. They're in crisis mode. So although the stimulus money is good, we also have to couple this with some type of intervention and education on how to get individuals out of this situation. And education it goes from the beginning to the end. So I also would like to see if there is an opportunity to erase some of this stuff off of people's record, that there be some type of accountability for the individuals who are going to benefit from having this erased from their record. Renting 101 or budgeting and financing, or identifying behaviors that may have led them to this even before COVID hit, right? And educating them on those behaviors to interrupt it, so that not only do they make it through this, but they make it through and end up in home ownership, right? They make it through and show their children that they don't have to stay in the same generational curse that they and their parents have done. So if we could use this moment as a spring forward to educate our community and to help them understand that even though they're down, they don't have to stay down, but it's up to them. It's not up to a system. It's not up to a resource or a provider. It's up to the individual to make that first step and to be committed to change.
I do understand what you're saying there, and I've heard it voiced before. The only thing that I would submit to that, and I'd love to hear your response to this, is if the system itself is flawed, and I hope we can agree that it is, if the
It is.
system itself is flawed and it put people in these positions where they're unsuccessful in the first place, wouldn't the first and best solution be to address the system and then give people those tools that you're talking about so that they don't end up back in that same position?
Good question. Good question. So, yes, right? My short answer is yes, fix the system. But we all know that fixing the system is going to take, I don't even know, to be honest with you. I could give you a blueprint of the system and the way it is and the way it should be, right? From the perspective of working in this field for 30 years, seeing what works and what doesn't work, and putting things in place that could reach the minds and souls and bodies of individuals who are struggling. However, at the same time, if we work with individuals and look at their behaviors and their response to crisis and get them to see past woe is me, empowering them, showing them the things to do alongside of reaching out for help from a system. Because at the end of the day, the system's not going to solve this. It really isn't. It could be the best system in the world, but if the individual still has those innate behaviors that are causing them to make some of the decisions that they're making in their life, and by no means am I blaming anyone, but I am saying that we all know, if we're going to be honest, that we have some behaviors that need to be interrupted. So if we can work together, one person at a time, to recognize and interrupt some of those behaviors, we won't be so dependent on the system, so that when it does start getting better, when it does start being recreated or revised, people are ready. People are ready to reap the benefits of a better system.
Thank you, Angela. And well, my curiosity comes and where you mentioned some of those innate behaviors, and whenever I hear the word innate, it's almost always something that I'm willing to challenge, only because so few things are innate. And so, what would you identify those behaviors as, like from the people that you work with?
So, I think for me is when I'm working with an individual who has children. Well, let me start over. If I'm working with an individual that has children and has grandchildren, right, and they're all in the same home, and what those children and grandchildren are hearing is everything that's going on in that home is somebody else's fault, which we know it could be. We know that a lot of factors can come into what's going on in an individual's life, but the impact on that child and that grandchild would be so different if the conversation was, this is what I did, this is what I could have done better, and then this is the responsibility of blank, blank, blank. It talks to ownership, it talks to acceptance, because at the end of the day, we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to ourselves to be open and honest with ourselves about what's going on in our households. But if you have a grandmom that's cussing a landlord out because the landlord didn't fix something, so that's why they're not going to pay their rent, that's teaching that child and that grandchild, oh, if something's broken in my apartment, I don't have to pay my rent, when that's not true. Right? We need to educate people what the laws are in landlord-tenant so they don't find themselves in some of the situations that they're in.
So where I would jump in there, and I have a question for you, but first I do want to say that there are definitely some instances where folks could withhold rent for lack of services. So one of those things could be if your heat in your apartment has been broken all winter and your landlord has refused to fix it or just plainly ignored your calls to fix it, you could withhold rent for that. Now, how you go about that is definitely something that I think could be advisable. If you're gonna, I don't think you would get much of anywhere cussing out your landlord.
Or withholding your rent and not doing it legally. So there is landlord-tenant laws in Pennsylvania, right? And in those laws, it speaks exactly how to handle a situation like that, because tenants have the right to safe and habitable housing, right? So if the landlord is violating the lease, the tenant has actionable things that they can do to hold the landlord accountable. But withholding the rent is going to start an eviction process, right? You're going to go to court for that eviction. The landlord's going to say they have not paid their rent. The tenant's going to say, well, he hasn't had rent, he hasn't had heat in the place in 6 months. The judge is going to say, well, can you show me that you've put your rent money aside? And then the tenant is not going to have that money set aside, right? So then the landlord is going to probably the judge is probably going to give the landlord 30 days to get that heat fixed. But when you go back to court, that tenant has to have all that money, or it's going to be an eviction. So following the law, getting to know the law, knowing that there is a law that protects landlords and tenants is what is the message that we need to get out there.
Yeah, and I think I understand where you're coming from, Angela. And I think what you're preaching for is people to be more literate on the laws and what is expected and these interactions when you have a situation when your landlord is not fulfilling their services as a lease, which is a legal contract, says they should. And I understand that. But you also point to something which is, the system in itself being disadvantaging people of color, Black people, Indigenous people. And so why correct me if I'm wrong, what I think I'm hearing here is that can't be used as an excuse. Would that be correct? And sure.
I'm sorry.
Would it be correct to say that your stance is that even with the disadvantages given to BIPOC folks, that the system itself can't be used as an excuse for lack of home
Correct.
or lack of circumstances?
Correct. It cannot be the sole reason.
Okay, and so, well, I think that some people will push back on that, and they would have the question for you: wouldn't that be blaming BIPOC folks for their own trauma and the results thereof?
No, it's not about blaming. Okay, when we look at a system that's broken and fragmented and not conducive to real change and empowerment, that's a broken system. When we look at ourselves, if we don't start looking at ourselves to see where we need to change, it's not about blaming. It's about wanting to be stronger. It's about wanting to be more knowledgeable. And I'm saying that as a fact because when individuals call into the Fair Housing Council and ask for advice or ask for help, because for whatever reason, their lease, the repairs are not being done. By the time I'm done talking to that individual, 99.9% of the time they say, wow, I didn't even know that. And so I follow that up by, well, if you would have known that, then what would you have done differently? And they speak exactly what they would have done differently. So it's not about blaming. I have my own shortcomings, right? But I'm not going to focus on what they are. I'm going to focus on educating myself so that they're not that anymore, so that they become that strength and that pillar for me to move forward. So no way in the world am I blaming people. I just want people to be empowered and encouraged to ask questions. It doesn't have to be something as big and massive as a system change, because look how long the system's been broken. So if we all sit around and wait for the system to change, our generations are just going to keep on evolving into poverty, into homelessness, into generational abuse, right? But if we empower ourselves to educate ourselves on how we can work within that broken system, because it can be done. There's plenty of people that are doing it. That is a good start for our community.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you for taking some time to talk with me on this, and I appreciate our conversation. I think that some folks will disagree with it. I think that some folks will find it useful. For the folks that find it useful, or for the folks that disagree with it, all the same, they might want to enact some change or do something to help these people. So how can they help people like the people that you work with at the men's shelter?
So the individuals at the men's shelter, the best way to contribute and to help them would be to reach out to Christian Churches United. That is the organization that is overseeing the funding for the men's winter overnight shelter and the women's winter overnight shelter. Volunteering, making a donation, sponsorship. But if they go to the website, they can see all types of opportunities that they can help the homeless population. In relation to Fair Housing Council, as you know, there's very limited landlords. Once an individual has this blemish on their record, it makes them even makes it even harder for them to find a landlord. They fall prey to predatory landlords and get themselves in situations out of being desperate to have a roof over their head that can lead them down an even bigger rabbit hole. So helping us to educate people, helping us getting on the website and learning what the landlord tenant laws are, so that when individuals do find themselves in this situation, to act on it as quickly as possible, to don't feel defeated, don't feel like you lost. Find some type of empowerment in educating yourself and reaching out for help.